So we've discussed the discovery of the Americas and with Columbus coming and the treatment of Native Americans. We saw that disease wiped out a majority of the population of Native Americans that the Spanish and other countries were using to work the land. So it was really important for them to replace those dead Native Americans with somebody else. And so that's when they turned to Africa and looked into creating something that becomes known as the Atlantic slave trade. Um, so, different causes of the African slavery. America was built, the American colonies were built on cheap labor for specifically tobacco, cotton, and sugar plantations. It's an agricultural society. Europeans are looking to make money, and this is the best way that they can think of making money is by growing these cash crops. Like I said before, the Native Americans have been dying off and needed to be replaced. They're dying off because of the disease, specifically smallpox, that was decimating the different populations around uh, the Americas. So it's important to know that this isn't the first time slavery has ever been used. It had been in Africa and been going on for hundreds of years, specifically with Muslim traders going to sub-Saharan Africa and abducting people and bringing them to the Middle East, where they could be used as slaves. The Portuguese were the first who explored Africa, as we saw with Prince Henry the Navigator, and they really set up some trading posts along the coast of Africa. At first, they wanted gold, but once the discovery of the Americas happened, this desire for interactions with Africa really changed from gold to slaves with the colonization of the Americas. Brazil is going to become a leader of the importers of slaves. So some advantages of the African slaves over the Native Americans is first that they had the exposure to European diseases. So they had immunity, which Native Americans who had never been exposed to these diseases didn't have. Africans were really experienced in farming, and they brought a lot of new techniques that would actually help the growth and the yield of a lot of these different crops. They were less likely to escape because they didn't know the land. They were stolen from their own land and shipped to a completely different part of the world, so they didn't know where to go. And in addition, their skin color made it easier to catch them if they escaped. So if you found a slave in a Native American village, you could tell that this African slave did not belong. So the slave trade started off in the early 1500s and 1600s, as we read in the article. Columbus is kind of considered the first slave trader. But between 1500 and 1600, about 300,000 Africans were transported to the Americas, which is quite a bit, but it really starts picking up in the 16 to the 1700, where 1.3 million Africans were transported to the Americas. So you can see on the right-hand side of this screen here, just take a look at that chart and the number of different Africans that were shipped to the Americas during this time. You can see from 1700 to 1800, over 6 million Africans were shipped to the Americas. So by the end of slavery, around 1870, about 9.5 million Africans have been transported to the Americas. So this is a large number of the population of the colonies in the Americas. So Spain was the first country to really lead the slave trade in importing Africans. They moved from the Caribbean to the American mainland. So they started off in the Caribbean and farming there, but eventually they ran out of space and started moving to the mainland. And they needed more slaves for plantations. So by 1650, nearly 300,000 slaves labored for the Spanish. So they were the leaders of the slave trade. During the 1600s, however, the Portuguese surpassed the Spanish in this trade, and this is mainly because of the fact that Brazil dominates the European sugar market, and sugar cane, as you guys know, living in Nicaragua, takes a lot of labor. And so they need cheap labor for sugar plantations. So during the 1600s or the 17th century, 38% of all African brought to the Americas went to Brazil. And Brazil by far is the country that has the largest population of slaves in the Americas, which is maybe different than what we've learned in the past. I know as an American myself, we're taught that most slaves just came to the United States, but we see that Brazil actually had a large proportion of them. Eventually, though, England starts to dominate the slave trade. So, with their influence in the Americas growing, so does Britain's dominance of the slave trade. So, from 1690 to 1807, they become the leading carrier of enslaved Africans. So, it started off with the Spanish, then kind of goes to the Portuguese, but then eventually the British take over. By 1807, England had transported 1.7 million slaves to the colonies, and nearly 400,000 were sold to Britain's North American colonies. So this very different from Brazil. In Brazil, they pretty much got worked to death. In the United States, however, or in the North American colonies, the slave population actually grew. So the slave owners in the United States actually encouraged their slaves to have children because that would mean they would actually have more slaves. So by 1830, roughly 2 million slaves were in the United States, and that number would grow considerably. So it's really important to note that it was not just the Europeans that were involved in the slave trade business. Without the help of Africans themselves, this could not have worked out the way it did. So many African rulers played an actual significant role in the slave trade. Slaves were often prisoners of war that were captured inland in Africa and then brought to the coast and sold. African merchants sold them to European merchants in exchange for gold, guns, and other goods. So manufactured goods from Europe would be brought down to Africa and sold to the Africans for slaves, and then they would be shipped across the Atlantic Ocean. Eventually, after a couple hundred years, some of these African rulers started to figure out that this is probably not a good thing for the African continent and started to fight against the slavery. But if you take a look at this image down here, you can see that the slaves are being transported from the interior to the exterior. This would be an African that had gotten a gun from a European and is doing his trade. So this all starts something known as triangular trade. So slaves become part of this transatlantic trading network known as triangular trade. So from Europe manufactures goods, so they transport this manufactured goods to the west coast of Africa, right? Specifically guns, clothes, maybe some rum, things like that. In Africa, they sell those guns and clothes, and they pick up gold as well as slaves, and they take that to the West Indies and the Americas. And then the Americas, that's where you're producing your raw materials, and those things are getting shipped back to Europe where they can be refined and manufactured. So if you take a look at this image, you can see how kind of a triangle develops here, right? So from Europe, from England or wherever, they go to West Africa, from West Africa to the West Indies to the Americas, and then back over to Europe. So that's why we call it the triangular trade. But you got to know that manufactured goods come from Europe, slaves from Africa, and then your raw materials are going to be coming from the Americas. So consequences of the slave trade are obviously devastating in more ways than one. In Africa itself, there's several cultures that lost generations of their fittest and most able members. The young men in particular were the ones that would get sold for the most money, so they were the most desirable. Families were torn apart, and it also introduced guns to the continent, which will have big repercussions in the future. And the Americas, it's one of those mixed blessings. So one, it did contribute a huge amount of labor to the Americas. Their experience in agriculture improved farming techniques. They also brought their art, music, religion, and food when they came across. And still to this day, there's substantial populations of African Americans across the region.